Hello and welcome. My name is William Wesley. I'm an author, I'm a top performance coach, and I'm a management trainer. But today I'm here to talk about the propositions. And today my guest is our state's legislative analyst, Mr. Mac Taylor. Mac, welcome.
Nice to be with you.
Glad to have you. Well, last year Mac and I got together and we actually covered the propositions from last year's election. And we decided, since we had so much fun, to do it again. So today we're going to talk about the 11 propositions that are on this November ballot. So if you're home, get a pen and paper, call your friends. Maybe you've read your guide, maybe you haven't, but hopefully we'll give you some insight and help you make an intelligent decision. So Mac, again, welcome. We only have 11 propositions this year, so we're going to take them from the top and see what they're about.
Okay.
So Proposition 1. Tell us about Proposition 1.
Well, Proposition 1 is a $4 billion Housing Bond Act. Mm-hmm. And the reason that the people have to vote on this, the legislature passed it, but the state constitution requires that voters also approve any new liabilities that are taking on. So that's why it's in front of the people.
Got it. It's a legislative act as opposed to an initiative brought by the people.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so this $4 billion would be spent on various purposes. There's a figure on your screen that shows how that money is allocated. Mm-hmm. Of the $4 billion, a big chunk goes for multifamily housing for low-income people. Mm-hmm. Another chunk goes for homeowner assistance to low and moderate-income people. Mm-hmm. There's also $1 billion for veterans. It helps subsidizes loans for veterans. That part of the money typically has no cost to the state because the veterans pay back through their monthly mortgage payments enough to cover the cost. The other $3 billion, however, are a cost to the state. Mm-hmm. In order to pay off the bonds that the state borrows to have this money up front,
right.
It has to, just like a mortgage,
exactly.
It has to make yearly payments for 25 to 30 years, and that will cost the state about $170 million a year. And that's money that otherwise can't be spent on other things the legislature might want to.
So you're referring to the interest payments they pay to the folks who invest in the bonds.
Interest and principal.
Got it.
And that's pretty much Proposition 1.
Okay. So it sounds good. It sounds like something we need. So I was looking to find out who supports this in the California League of Cities, the County Supervisor Associations, Habitat for Humanity. And then I was looking to see who opposes it. And we have, since it's essentially a tax, we have the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association.
Well, and to be clear, it's not really a tax because when you have a bond, it has to be paid off from existing revenues. The measure itself doesn't provide any new revenues.
Okay, so it's a general obligation
It's
bond.
just a general obligation bond that has to be paid from whatever revenues the state has. So the choice for people is, do they feel like that $170 million in annual debt service, what am I giving up? What can't I spend that $170 million on because it's going to the debt service?
Got it. Well done, sir. Proposition 2. Now, Proposition 2, as I understand, has something to do with the millionaire tax. Now, my first question about that is, that tax was passed in 2004.
Yes.
And what it simply said was, after a certain amount of money, there was a 1% tax on those who make a huge amount of money. And please expand on that. But since 2004, we've been collecting that money.
Yes.
So this initiative says we now want to spend the money, but I guess I first want to ask, where's the money?
Well, the money that you referred to from this tax on very high income people, it raises anywhere between $1.5 to $2.5 billion a year. Okay. It varies so much because the income of high income people can vary depending on where we are in the business cycle. Mm-hmm. So that money, whatever's raised, has to be dedicated for county mental health services.
Okay.
So what happened, let's fast forward from 2004 to 2016. Mm-hmm. The legislature said, let's take a piece of that money that we just talked about that comes in annually, and let's use it to pay off $2 billion in bonds. And we want to take that bond money and use it for housing for the mentally ill, homeless, or at risk of being homeless. Mm-hmm. And that would probably take about $120, $130 million a year to pay off that $2 billion in bonds. So really all it's doing, the legislature had this program to say, we're just going to use a piece of those monies to help the mentally ill in a different way than it was being used. In order to do that program, though, you had to have the courts come in and say, it's okay for you to issue those bonds.
Exactly.
And it's okay to use those monies for this purpose. And rather than waiting for the courts that have been hearing that decision, the legislature and the governor just said, let's put the measure in front of the people
Exactly.
to say, is it okay for us to do this program? It's called the No Place Like Home program, in order to issue that $2 billion in bonds. So the fiscal effect of the measure is simply, do we want to take a small piece of that $1.5 to $2.5 billion a year and have debt service to go for this housing for mentally ill people?
Got it. And as I cruise through the different sites, I see no opposition, and I also see no specific support. There's not an organization stepping up saying, hey, we're really for this. So it's pretty much in front of the people, and the people will make their decision. Proposition 3.
Another bond act. This one, however, wasn't put on by the legislature. It was done through initiative. So it's an $8.9 billion water bond, water and environmental purposes. People may remember in June of this year, of 2018, they voted on a $4 billion bond that was put on by the legislature. This was done through an initiative process, so it's in addition to the bond that was just approved. The $9 billion would be spent on a variety of purposes. There's a figure on your screen that gives a real general outline of the way those funds would be allocated. But basically, you can think about it as being for almost anything water related. It could help on a watershed by thinning out forest. It could repair a levee. It could be used to improve drinking water facilities run by cities or sewage systems. So just a whole array of purposes. Most of the money will be distributed to local governments because a lot of our water services are provided through local water agencies.
Absolutely.
And a small portion of the money would have to be matched at the local level. So the fiscal effect of this bond, again, like the others, it's on the annual debt service, which could, after most of the bonds are sold, be $430 million a year. So again, the measure doesn't raise money. Of our general fund, state general fund revenues, it just means that much will have to be spent each year, and it won't be available for other things.
Got it. So how does it relate to the $4 billion that was already allocated for?
Similar, but just different purposes.
Okay.
Many of the funds are designated for specific entities or specific purposes, and folks would have to go into more detail to kind of know what all of those allocations are, because there's a lot of them.
Okay, so the supporters here, Ducks Unlimited, California Waterfowl Association, and the Wildlife Association. No opposition registered at this point. Again, it's just, the issue is debt service. The issue is how much of our general fund do we want to put in this space in terms of water. And the whole idea of opportunity cost, meaning if I spend here, I can't spend there.
That's well put.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Proposition 4, which talks to children's hospitals.
This is our last bond issue.
Okay.
This was done by an initiative, not by the legislature. There are basically 13 hospitals throughout the state that are called children's hospitals. And these are hospitals that really specialize in very severe and complex children's diseases and conditions, whether it's congenital or otherwise. And the voters in the past have approved measures. Back in 2004, they approved $750 million. And in 2008, they approved $980 million. These dollars would go for various capital. They could improve and renovate existing facilities or expand their existing facilities. And I believe we have a figure on the screen that will show people how those are allocated. Each of the 8 nonprofit children's hospitals would get $135 million each. And each of the 5 University of California hospitals would get $54 million each. And there's a small amount of money that could go to other hospitals that, while they're not designated as children's hospitals per se, they do provide a lot of services to them and would be eligible for grants.
Okay. And is it the fact that, are these hospitals basically hurting in terms of, without this bill or without this money, these hospitals will end up where?
I think they would have to raise the money from other sources, or they wouldn't be able to expand. So that's really an issue, one of the things that I think voters would have to take into account. Again, as far as the debt service, on this $1.5 billion in bonds, it would be about $80 million a year for roughly 30, 35 years.
Got it. And you mentioned prior expenditures. Were those capital expenditures
Yes.
too? Okay.
Yes, they
so
were.
Those funds are exhausted.
Pretty much, almost all of them have been spent or
Okay.
committed.
And historically, we support those hospitals periodically with this type of.
The voters have.
Right.
Most of their money is raised privately, especially for the nonprofits. So this is just as you say, it's an opportunity cost. Is this a high enough priority versus the other ways that we might use the monies?
Okay, so we've talked about Proposition 1, that's $4 billion in bonds. Proposition 2 authorizes probably another $2 billion for the program, then another almost $9 billion in Proposition 3, and then $1.5 billion here. What would be your ballpark in terms of the debt service if we put all those together?
Yeah, I didn't add that up, but it's probably close to what, 900 to
900 to
$800 or
a billion,
$900 million a year in annual debt service.
Got it. And that comes out of our so these are general obligation bonds, which says based on whatever the state has, it pays with, as opposed to a specific revenue bond.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. Now, no opposition for Proposition 4 as far as what we see at this point, but we see, but in addition for support, we have Children's Hospital Association plus the 8 children's hospitals who would be funded by the measure. Let's talk Prop 5.
Prop 5 deals with property taxation for certain individuals, primarily people 55 and older. My group. I don't know about yours, William. You look way too young to be eligible for this. But let me give it a little background because this one gets a little complicated, and you help me if I'm going into too much detail.
Absolutely.
Okay? If you own a home, you obviously pay property taxes on it. And the property taxes are based on not what the home is worth out on the market, but what we'll call taxable or assessed value. So let's say that I bought a home in Solano 15 years ago and I paid $200,000 for it. Well, that home could easily be worth $500,000 today. But my taxable value might only be $250,000 because of Proposition 13, which limits the annual increases that you pay in your property taxes.
Right.
Now, if I go out and buy a new home, I have to now pay taxes on that market value of the home. I could buy exactly the same home that I'm in across the street and my taxes would go up because that's just the way that we do things.
Right.
Now,
So it's the current assessed value
it's
of
based
the
on
new property you purchase.
Now, before we even talk about Prop 5, there is a program, however, there is provisions in the Constitution that if I'm 55 years or older, I'm living in Solano, I can move within the county to a home it can't be market value of more than what my home currently is valued. And I can carry my lower assessed value into that new home and avoid paying higher property taxes. Currently.
Right.
But it has to be within the county. I can only do it once, and I can't have a home that's more expensive than the home I'm currently in.
Do we see a lot of people doing that?
Not tons.
Okay.
You might have a lot of people who would move from a larger house after they retire to a smaller. So it definitely does happen. Now, what would Prop 5 do? Prop 5 would in effect expand those exemptions to have it apply in more cases. So now if I'm 55 or older, I don't have to move to Solano. I can move anywhere in the state, and I can take my property value, that lower property assessed value, to my new home.
So now your property assessed value or the tax as resulting from it is portable.
It's portable. You keep that lower value. You don't have this increase in property taxes. And so it applies it more broadly. I can also buy a more expensive home. And it's a kind of a complicated formula. You'd have to go into the voter guide to get the specifics. But basically, exactly what you say, you sort of carry your existing assessed value, something close to that.
To
your new
home. If I go
home.
from $2 million to $1 million, that new assessed value, it's still
You have to look at the formula exactly, but the principle is you get to carry and keep pretty much your lower base assessed value. And that would cost a lot of money to do because a lot of people move now that are paying those high prices. Now they'll have lower property taxes. We estimate that in the near term it could cost schools and other local governments each up to $100 million a year, but it grows over time to as much as $1 billion each for schools and local governments over time. The state has to backfill those school losses pretty much, so it'd be a state cost of almost $1 billion a year over time.
Okay, so you have folks who really think this is a great idea, and you have some folks who don't. As we look at that, the net effect to the individual, though, that net effect, have we ballparked that? If we take an average home in California, whatever that number is now, what does that mean to the individual?
Yeah, I mean, it could be thousands of dollars in savings, obviously, with home prices what they are. And what makes it hard to answer your question is because, as you know, it depends on the value of the home and how long you've been in the home.
Exactly.
So if you've been there for a long time, you have this huge difference between what a home is worth and what your assessed value is. So it's a little bit hard to answer that specifically.
Okay, so we have the California Association of Realtors who support this measure, and teachers and law enforcement and public unions don't support it. Now, I know you can't take sides, you're giving information, but would you be able to just gander as to why teachers would not want this?
Well, I think it probably speaks to the fiscal effect on the state. It doesn't really change the overall funding under our school funding formulas that go out, but maybe it's because the state has to backfill more. There's less money available that could be used for other purposes.
Right, and the suspicion is maybe then the state doesn't backfill to the teachers' needs and law enforcement, et cetera.
Exactly.
Got it. Well, it's interesting. Let's talk Prop 6.
Prop 6, people are probably going to hear a lot about, deals with transportation taxes. The measure itself is relatively straightforward. Currently, the legislature can only pass a tax. The state legislature can pass a state tax with a 2/3 vote. It doesn't have to go to the voters, though. This measure simply says for transportation taxes, like our gas taxes and diesel taxes, and vehicle-related taxes, in the future, the legislature has to pass with the 2/3 vote, and the voters have to approve those. So it makes it more difficult to pass transportation taxes in the future. Now, the second provision is what will get a lot of attention. In 2017, last year, the legislature increased our taxes, gas taxes, diesel taxes, and others, to raise about $5 billion a year. This measure would eliminate those taxes, anything that had been passed after January 1 of 2017. So those taxes would go away. If the legislature wanted to reimpose them, they would have to vote again for them and put them before the voters.
Got it. So this is the gas tax.
This is the gas tax.
That was approved in 2017. That said, we're paying a little more. It's about 10, 11 cents per gallon or so.
And there's a figure on the screen that will give an outline of what the various increases were, but they do differ between
Gas,
the diesel
exactly.
and sales taxes on diesel.
Okay.
So it's a little more complicated, but yes, the taxes went up.
Okay. So then a lot of folks were up in arms about that because it was another tax as perceived by them, and it was more money. So there have been some changes, and then this was an initiative or more of a legislative act to say, let's bring it in front of folks again.
This was an initiative of
so
people that were in effect against those increases.
Got it. So they went out and got the signatures and said, let's try this again.
Yeah.
Okay. So the people for this, the support, we have John Cox, a Republican. We have the Howard Jarvis Association. There's also an organization called Road Builders. And again, the idea is to repeal the fuel tax. Now, would you just go over it again, not the repeal of the fuel tax, but the first part of the tax, the change in terms of the 2/3?
That right now, the legislature can pass those taxes with a 2/3 vote.
Got it.
They don't have to go to the voters. And now with this measure, in the future, the legislature can pass it, but they have to submit those to the voters for the approval.
Excellent. Thank you. Proposition 7. Let's talk a little bit about daylight savings.
Let's shed some light on this.
Let's shed some light on daylight savings time.
This is a kind of an unusual one. It's not real complicated, but federal law sets our time zones. And federal law also sets daylight savings times. Between March and November, we leap forward and spring back and, all that sort of stuff.
And most folks may know this, but some might not. But daylight savings time essentially started during World War II as an energy saving measure.
That was the way it was pitched, yes. California voters back in 1949 approved daylight savings time. The people did. So what that means is when the people do something through initiative, it can only be changed by having those issues come before the voters again.
Right, right.
So that is, if we wanted to go off daylight savings time, you'd have to have the people vote on it. That's essentially what is before them now. The measure very simply says that the legislature, with a 2/3 vote, can do whatever they want with the time as long as the federal government allows it. So for example, even though the federal government does not currently allow you to go on daylight savings the entire year-round, if they did approve that change, the legislature with a 2/3 vote could go along with that and put California on a year-round daylight savings time. Or conversely, it could put us on year-round standard time without us changing our clocks twice a year.
Exactly.
So it's really just, the measure doesn't do anything by itself because it would require action by the federal government and then by the legislature. And even if that all happened, it's not really clear there'd be a huge fiscal effect on state and local governments.
Exactly.
But it would allow us to do things differently than we are now on our daylight savings.
Okay, that was Prop 7. Now let's chat about Proposition 8, which ties into dialysis clinics. Tell me about that, Mac.
Well, people with kidney failure or end-stage renal disease have to do dialysis. They have to go into a clinic 3 times a week in order to purify their blood. And these clinics are typically nonprofit or profit, and I think we have a visual on the screen that will show you the companies that provide the services. It's dominated by 2 companies in the state. And these services are typically paid for by Medicare, the federal program, but also by state funds too, the Medi-Cal program, and by private insurance. So it's a variety of funding sources. The measure is a little complicated, but at its essence, it requires these clinics, you can pick any of the ones that we showed you on the screen, to pay rebates to private providers if their total revenues that they raise are more than 15% more than certain allowable cost. And this gets a little technical about what is allowable and what might be included or not. But it's an effort to try to limit what some of these firms, these dialysis clinics, are making. In doing the fiscal on this, it was very difficult because there's a lot of uncertainties about what expenses might be included in the calculation. It's also, there's a lot of uncertainty about how firms, the ones we showed you on the figure, how are they going to respond to this measure?
Exactly.
In some cases, if it limited their profits too much, they might cut back operations, they might change their mix of expenses. And so not knowing that, it's a little hard to estimate. The impact on state and local governments could range from savings in the tens of millions of dollars a year to cost in the tens of millions of dollars a year, depending on some of those uncertainties.
Right. And the monitoring of it. So then do we audit their audit?
There will have to be, obviously, to enforce it will take resources by the state.
Okay, so Prop 8, it's funded by, or the expenditure to put this on the ballot is funded by the United Healthcare Workers, and they've been trying to unionize dialysis clinics for years. In opposition, we have the California Medical Association, the California Hospital Association, and the American Nurses Association. You mentioned there are primarily 2 organizations that do, what, 90% of the dialysis?
I think in California it's about 70. I believe the chart will show you, but 2 fairly dominant firms.
Okay. So, more to be revealed there. I find that somewhat interesting. Now, we would normally go to Proposition 9, which was the initiative to divide California into 3 states. That has since been pulled off the ballot, so we'll go right to Proposition 10. Tell us about Prop 10, Mac.
Probably people think about Proposition 10, or they will talk about it as the rent control related measure. Several cities currently limit, in some ways, what landlords of rental property can charge. However, there was a 1995 state law, it's referred to as Costa-Hawkins, that put boundaries on what cities and local governments can do in limiting what landlords can charge in 3 very important ways. You can't limit what you charge when you rent out single-family properties, homes. You can't limit what can be charged in rent on facilities, housing that was built after 95.
Okay.
And you can't limit what you charge in rent when a particular unit is vacated by someone and someone new is brought in. So that might have been under some controls, but when you have a new tenant comes in, you can raise the rent,
market rent,
and then it's controlled thereafter.
Got it.
That's Costa-Hawkins. That's
Got
what
it.
the state restricts locals from doing. This measure simply repeals Costa-Hawkins. So that now local governments, if they want, particularly cities,
San Francisco,
Berkeley, various Bay Areas, and Santa Monica, they would have more ability to control rents on housing, single-family housing, housing built after 95, and even when someone leaves, they could still control that unit when there's a new tenant coming in. So this measure, I think people will hear a lot about in the coming campaign. It will have, if it were approved by the voters, it would have lots of different economic effects.
right?
We estimate that it would probably reduce property taxes and probably income taxes, but it could increase some sales taxes because if you have more rent control, individuals
More
might
folks
have
may
more
live
money that they could.
discretionable, yeah.
Exactly,
Got it.
exactly. So we think that it would be a net revenue loss to state and local governments. It would depend on how many local governments took advantage of their ability to do greater rent control. It could be in the tens of millions of dollars, if not many do it, but it could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars in net revenue losses if a lot of city governments did that.
Got it. So the supporters here, Coalition for Affordable Housing, opposition, California Apartment Association, and the California Rental Housing Association. In the actual bill, Mac, does it specify, is it 1%, 2%, 3% in terms of the max, or the states or the local municipalities have the ability to control it?
The locals would control it, and they are governed by a general provision, both in constitutional and case law, that you have to give landlords a fair return. And so this would have to be played out probably in a lot of suits
Described
on it.
fair, exactly.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Now let's talk about Proposition 11, which essentially allows ambulance workers to have breaks. So give us the details.
That sounded simple, but it's actually a lot more complicated. Most ambulance services in California are provided through private companies. And they obviously hire the EMTs, emergency medical technicians, and paramedics that man those ambulances. And what's interesting about these ambulance services, that in order to make sure that they have coverage, that they can respond in the time necessary, they move around throughout the day. So that if you have someone responding, when they go to that call, you may reposition the other ambulance services.
So they're not in that same purview.
Exactly, and they can respond quickly and handle their coverage area. Currently, and in the past, these ambulance employees were always on call, even during rest breaks. So if they're having lunch and they get a call, they respond. And you can sort of understand why.
Exactly.
And there was a 2016 Supreme Court decision in California. It wasn't on ambulance drivers, it was on security guards. But they said that not requiring people to actually have a lunch break and rest breaks where you're not on call was against California labor law. And so we think that right now, if you apply that same logic to ambulance services, they would have to change the way they operate in order that people would have to have definite rest and meal times.
Right.
This would require more ambulances and higher cost, which would then be reflected in the cost to local governments to provide these services. So what this measure does, it says we're just going to continue our historical practice where these employees will have to be on call, and therefore the services wouldn't incur these costs that we think they're otherwise going to have to incur because of this court decision. And so this measure, if it's approved by the voters, in effect would keep costs lower by allowing this historical practice of being on call.
So I can be on call, I'm having my sandwich, it goes off, and I have to go.
I have to respond. Now maybe I'll have another period where I can enjoy my lunch or enjoy my rest break, but you're not guaranteed it. It would just continue historical practice. And that would result, by allowing that historical practice, in effect this would result probably in some savings to local governments.
Got it. So we have the American Medical Response. That's a large ambulance company who's supporting that, and no opposition to date. So, Mac, let's wrap up with Proposition 12, which talks about confined animals in terms of what happens to them while they're confined
Exactly.
and how that transfers into our food.
Let's go back to 2008 when the voters approved Proposition 2, and that set various housing standards for egg-laying hens, for pregnant pigs, and for calves raised for veal. And this is where people were concerned about confinement, overly confined.
Right.
And it set standards so that these animals would have some room to move around. This measure really, you can think of it as sort of expanding that and providing even more space.
Okay.
And also by 2020, if the measure were approved by the voters, you would have in effect cage-free chickens. You could designate the total amount of space, but they would not be confined to any one cage. They would in fact roam around within a facility.
Got it.
And it also requires that other states that we buy products from have to have those same standards.
Got it.
So it basically is, again, as I say, it would take what the voters passed, but it would take it even further in providing even more space for these types of animals. There could be some small reduction in state revenues to the extent that if some businesses didn't want to meet those requirements or had higher cost and less profits because they had to meet those standards. We don't see a real dramatic fiscal effect, though, on state or local
Got
governments.
it. And is it more in terms of the humane aspect of it, or is what happens when an animal is confined and how adrenaline and cortisol are released into the animal, into the meat, et cetera?
You know, I'm not sure what the proponents of the measure would push, but I think your first point that it basically speaks to treating the animals in a more humane way, that they have more unrestricted movements.
Got it. So on that note, the supporter there, primary supporter is Humane Society, and the opposition is the California Association of Egg Farmers and the Humane Farming Association, along with PETA and Friends of Animals. So we have covered 11 propositions today. We talked about Proposition 1, which is simply a bond measure that talks to $4 billion in bonds for housing. We talked about Prop 2, that's the millionaire tax, essentially, and how that money now, with the bond support, will be transferred to homelessness, and ideally prevention, mental health types of things. We also talked about several others: Proposition 3, $9 billion, Proposition 4, a $1.5 billion children's hospital bond fund. And then, Matt, we talked about Proposition 5. Say what that is.
The property tax transfer for seniors.
Got it. Proposition 6.
That's the transportation taxes we'll probably be hearing a lot about.
Indeed. Proposition 7, we talked about permanent daylight savings time, and we'll see what happens there. Prop 8, Matt?
Proposition 8 is on the dialysis clinics. Again, a complicated one. People probably have to spend a little time fully understanding that one.
Indeed. Proposition 10, we're talking about allowing local governments to control the rents in their cities. Proposition 11.
Proposition 11 is the ambulance workers and on rest breaks and meals, whether we continue with our past practice or whether we change those to make sure that they have guaranteed rest breaks.
Got it. And Proposition 12, please.
More housing, more room to move for animals, certain types of animals on farms.
Got it. Matt Taylor, State Legislative Analyst. Excellent job as always. I'm William Wesley. We appreciate your time. Use this information to make an intelligent decision about your vote. Thank you.